On my first day at the new company, I noticed something strange. A camera in my office. I wasn't sure if it was really that unusual, but what made me uncomfortable was that I was the only one in the company with a camera in my office. It felt like I was being watched, yet no one had mentioned it. Curious and uneasy, I started paying attention to every action I took, wondering if my boss knew I was aware of the camera. On my first day at the new job, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, just getting familiar with the workspace and my new colleagues. However, when I walked into my office, I noticed something strange that I couldn't ignore. In the corner of the room, near a small shelf, there was a camera mounted on the wall with a cable running through it, leading into my boss's office. I wasn't sure if this was something normal, but it definitely made me feel uneasy. I understood that surveillance cameras could be a part of any office for security or monitoring purposes, but what struck me as odd was the placement of this one. It wasn't positioned near the door or any common areas where cameras are typically found. No, this camera was directed right at my desk. I wasn't handling anything sensitive like money or valuable items, so why was I the only one being watched so closely? As the day went on, my unease grew. Then something happened that made me even more suspicious. My boss mentioned something in passing that made me realize he knew exactly what I had been doing. It was an offhand comment, but it seemed like he was referencing something I had just done. Something that seemed too specific to be a coincidence. That moment confirmed my suspicion that he might have been watching me through the camera. Right after that, I started scanning the room more carefully, and sure enough, I found the camera tucked away in a cubby, with a small wire running into the wall that led to my boss's office. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched without my knowledge. What made it even more uncomfortable was the realization that I was the only person in the office with a camera watching them. No one else had this, and I didn't understand why I was singled out like this. After discovering the camera in my office, the feeling of being watched started to settle uneasily in my mind. Every action I took, no matter how small, made me hyper-aware of the fact that someone could be observing me. Whenever I spent too much time on my phone or took a break, I couldn't help but wonder if my boss had noticed. One morning, while I was taking a short break after finishing some work, I received a message in the company group chat. It was from one of my bosses, casually asking if anyone needed more tasks or help with anything since things were a bit slow. "If anyone needs something to work on, just let me know. I know things are a bit slow," the message said. It seemed like a simple, friendly offer, but it struck me as odd. It came right at the moment when I had spent more time than usual on my phone. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a coincidence. How did my boss know what I was doing unless he was watching me? I'm not one to be easily rattled, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't a direct accusation, but it was as if my boss was subtly reminding me to stay focused. I started to realize that every time I might slack off a bit, there would be an indirect message or comment from him that felt too perfectly timed to be just coincidence. It was like I was being quietly monitored, but no one was openly acknowledging it. I couldn't help but wonder why I was the only one being watched so closely. None of my colleagues seemed to have any surveillance cameras in their offices. It seemed unnecessary to keep an eye on me, especially considering my job didn't involve handling anything valuable or sensitive. Yet, there I was, under constant scrutiny. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but at the same time, I couldn't fully grasp what was happening. It all felt so subtle, so indirect, that I wasn't sure if I was imagining things or if this was really how things were going to be. The feeling of being monitored grew stronger with each passing day. Despite trying to ignore it, I couldn't help but feel more and more like I was constantly being watched. Every time I checked my phone or took a break, I found myself wondering if my boss was seeing me through that camera. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. In addition to the camera, there were the subtle hints and comments from my bosses. They never outright accused me of anything, but the timing of their messages felt too perfect. For example, whenever I spent too much time on my phone, I would receive a casual message in the group chat reminding everyone to stay focused, or "let me know if you need more work." It was never a direct comment on me, but the timing was always too coincidental. It made me wonder if they were monitoring my actions in real time, though they never directly acknowledged it. The oddest part was that I was the only one in the company who seemed to be under such scrutiny. None of my colleagues had cameras in their offices. I couldn't understand why my boss had chosen to watch me so closely when my job didn't involve anything valuable or sensitive. It made me feel like I was being tested or judged for something, even though I didn't know what. I kept going back and forth in my head. Was this normal? Was it just a way to make sure I stayed on task? Or was there something more to it? The uncertainty was driving me crazy. I didn't want to confront my boss directly because I wasn't sure if I was overthinking things. But at the same time, the lack of transparency was starting to feel invasive. It wasn't just the camera. It was the whole environment, where everything I did seemed to be noticed, but no one would ever say anything directly about it. I wasn't sure how long I could keep ignoring it, but I knew one thing for sure. I was the only one being watched in this way, and that fact alone made me question the true purpose behind it. Even though I still hadn't addressed the camera situation directly, life at the office continued on as usual. The feeling of being monitored didn't go away, but I didn't want to make things more awkward by bringing it up, especially since everything was otherwise going well. I enjoyed my work, got along with my colleagues, and didn't want to create unnecessary tension. So, I decided to let things play out and see if my bosses would eventually acknowledge that I knew about the camera. I kept watching for signs, hoping that they might accidentally reveal that they knew I was aware of the surveillance. I wasn't sure if I should bring it up myself or wait for them to say something. Part of me wanted to see how they would react to my behavior now that they knew I knew about the camera. If I acted like I wasn't aware of the surveillance, would they continue to monitor me the same way? I wanted to see if they would let anything slip, maybe giving me a reason to finally confront them. The thought crossed my mind to casually mention it, maybe make a comment in passing to let them know I knew, but I hesitated. I wasn't sure what the outcome would be. Would it make things uncomfortable? Would they become defensive or deny it? I wasn't eager to stir the pot, especially since I had no clear answer to why I was being watched in the first place. At the same time, I began to wonder whether I was reading too much into it. Was it really that big of a deal to have a camera in the office, especially when no one was outright doing anything wrong? I was still trying to figure out if this was just a way to make sure I stayed on task, or if there was something deeper at play. It was frustrating not knowing the full reasoning behind it, but I decided that for now I'd keep quiet and observe. One thing that kept me entertained during all this was imagining how I could respond if I chose to confront them. There were moments when something strange would happen, and I'd stare directly at the camera, almost as if I were breaking the fourth wall in some TV show. It made me chuckle, but also gave me a bit of satisfaction in feeling like I was in control of the situation, even if no one else knew it. Ultimately, I wasn't ready to bring it up yet. I still liked my job, and I didn't want to jeopardize the positive relationships I had with my colleagues. But if the situation escalated or I started feeling like things were becoming too creepy, I knew I would have to take action. Until then, I would continue working and observing, trying to find a way to make sense of everything. Even though I hadn't brought up the camera yet, things at work were still going smoothly. The feeling of being watched didn't entirely go away, but I decided to let it slide for the time being. I liked my job and I got along well with my colleagues, so I didn't want to make things uncomfortable by confronting my bosses. Instead, I chose to stay quiet and observe, hoping that eventually they would acknowledge the situation themselves. I wasn't sure whether it was best to address the issue directly or continue waiting for the right moment. Part of me wanted to see if my bosses would eventually let something slip, showing me that they knew I knew about the camera. But then I also wondered if I should just confront them outright and get it over with. It was a dilemma. How much longer should I keep pretending I didn't know? I didn't want to stir things up if it wasn't necessary, but the lack of transparency still made me feel uneasy. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the camera was just one part of the larger picture. There were other small, micromanaging things happening in the office that started to bug me. The subtle reminders about staying focused, or the random group chats asking if anyone needed work to do, all seemed a little too perfect. But again, no one directly confronted me, and everything felt vague enough that I couldn't tell if I was being paranoid or if there was an actual issue. I still couldn't fully understand why I was the only one being watched like this. No one else in the company seemed to have a camera in their office, and I had no special responsibilities that would warrant this kind of surveillance. Was I being tested in some way? Was my boss monitoring my integrity, or was there some other reason for it? The uncertainty was frustrating, but I kept reminding myself that as long as it didn't become overtly uncomfortable or invasive, I could deal with it. The more I thought about the camera, the more I started to see the humor in the situation. Every now and then, when something ridiculous would happen, or when I felt like breaking the tension, I'd stare directly at the camera, almost like I was breaking the fourth wall in a sitcom. It made me laugh, but it also gave me a small sense of control over the situation, as if I knew something my bosses didn't. For now, I decided not to bring it up. I liked my job, and despite the little annoyances, I was still enjoying the work and the people. If things started to get more uncomfortable or the surveillance became more obvious, I'd have no choice but to speak up. Until then, I would continue observing and trying to make sense of everything, hoping that eventually, the situation would become clear.